Hello and welcome to the second video of the part 5 in Java, our Java MTA course. In the fifth section we're talking about debugging, and in this video we're going to be focusing on runtime exceptions or runtime errors. Now it's important that you have a good idea of the difference between compile time errors and runtime errors, and so if you don't know the difference I would suggest that you go and watch the first video where we talk about the difference in those errors. If you have watched that and you are aware of the difference, let's continue. So importantly, we've compiled our Java source code and we've made this bytecode, this Java bytecode, and now we can run it. Now, when you're running this code, you'll have you have lines and lines of codes, and it will be executed one at a time. And the runtime errors means it will execute each line of code. So the stuff will be happening, things will be printing out in your console until it hits a runtime error. So there might be an error that it encounters while it's running your code, and then what will happen is this error will be create an exception object, which then you can use to do all sorts of things. So in Java, when you encounter a runtime error, and remember, a runtime error is an error that happens while you're running the code, it creates an exception. And there are a number of exception objects. We've got the arithmetic exception, the array index out of bounds, the string index out of bound, and the null point exception. There are many others, but if you can understand how the first three work, you'll have a good understanding, or a good enough understanding to get to pass the MTA exam. Now, the important thing about the exception is you can actually write code that will allow you to manage these errors, and that's why you have to have a good understanding of what these errors are. So if we look at the arithmetic exception here, you can see here we have these two numbers and then we divide them by each other. Now, you cannot divide by 0, so if you ever get into a code that divides by 0, or you have a possibility that it could divide by 0, so for example, if you ever have code where the user inputs a number that can be divided, if they put 0 and you haven't done checks on your code, it will produce a runtime error, so it will produce a arithmetic exception. It's the same with arrays. If you are if you've got two arrays here, and then you're printing out my array 2, which means that's the third value, if there isn't a third value there, it will produce a runtime error, not a compile error, but a runtime error. And the last one, a string indexed, is sometimes this string, which is a method or an object, you can use all sorts of methods with that object. So this method is creating a substring from our string, and it's starting off at the 5th character. But there is no 5th character, so it's going to produce an exception. So you've got a better idea of what exceptions are. The code will try and run it, it will fail to do it, and it will produce this object. The difference between compile and runtime errors is that in compile you have to fix the error or the code won't run. With runtime errors, you have to make code that manages that error, and that is what we're going to be doing in future videos. So now what I'm going to do now is throw some code at you and see if you have a good idea of what these exceptions are and how they work. So here's some code that I've created. It has 3 methods. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me, if I call each method, would an exception happen? If it does happen, what would be the name of the exception? And then explain why that exception happens or doesn't happen. So pause the video and see if you can answer the 3 questions. Okay, so hopefully you've stopped the video. Let's go through some of the answers. So the first method here, would this create an exception? Well, yes it would. So if you said it would, then you got that right. if we look at the code, number 4, we've created an array, and this array will contain 2 variables or 2 elements. We then created 2 string types, and now we're trying to insert it into the array. But if we're creating 2 elements, then we will not have created this space. So this space would be outside of the array's index. So this would create an array out of bounds, or array index out of bounds exception. So this would create an array index out of bounds exception. Number 2, would this one create it? Yes, this would also create an exception. So in the first value on line 12, we're creating an integer and it's 0. We're then creating a variable called flag, which is false. In line 14, we created an if statement that is on one line. So if it's on one line, you don't need to include that curly brackets. So we're saying if that flag is true, I want you to increase count by 1. But we've declared that flag value is false. So this if statement will not happen, which means that this 15 line, this is going to be dividing by 0. And dividing by 0 is not allowed, and so we'll create a arithmetic exception. So there'll be an error, an exception, a runtime error on the second method. And then the last one, well, the last exception, this should not create a error. So what we're doing here, again, or it should not create a runtime error, an exception. So what we've done on line 20, if we've created an array. This array has 2 values. This value is stored in 0. This one will be 1. And so it's saying, hey, we're going to put this, we're going to create a new string data type, or string variable, and we're going to insert, we're going to make a new string, a substring from this string, because remember, my array 0 would be hello, my array 1 is goodbye. And then let's have a look. So the substring will start on character 5. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it will produce a substring containing these 2 characters. So it'll go from 5 to the end of the substring. So it's not trying to access something that's out of bounds, it's within the bounds, and so it'll be inputted into there and then outputted. So there will not be an exception for the third method. Okay, so hopefully from this video you have a good idea of some common runtime errors and how exceptions are a way to show us those runtime errors. If you can answer these questions, then I think you have a very good understanding of the video and of this knowledge. So if you can explain the difference between a compile time error and a runtime error, then that's great. If you are able to explain some examples of exceptions, that's even better. And if you are able to explain the difference between an exception object and an arithmetic exception object, and why is it important to know the difference, that's fantastic, and I would like you to leave a comment to explain that below, because that would help other learners to get an idea of the differences between these exception objects. As always, we're going to continue with this course in later videos. We're going to be working with exception objects and understanding how we can deal with them with the code, so that when we encounter a runtime error, our code doesn't break but actually is able to manage with them. If you found this video useful, please like as always, or subscribe. And if you have any extra knowledge that you think would be helpful for other learners, please leave a comment in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.